The 18th and 19th Amendments were passed one right after the other, one right on the heels of the other. The 18th Amendment, the prohibition of alcoholic beverages across the country. The 19th Amendment, voting rights for women. So these two things were passed about a year and a half from each other. 18th Amendment in 1919, the 19th Amendment in 1920. And that's actually appropriate because it was largely women that drove the temperance movement, the movement to get people to stop drinking alcohol. And actually, the temperance movement had, prohibition sort of like the culmination of all of their efforts, of course. But the temperance movement had seen successes going all the way back to like the 1850s. And a lot of these temperance movement figures, these are colorful figures. A lot of these women in particular, they campaigned hard and they meant what they said. In fact, one of these more colorful temperance leaders, her name was Carrie Nation. In fact, I'm standing at the site of Carrie Nation's hotel in Texas. She ran a hotel here for a while. Carrie Nation was famous for her hatchinations, that's what they were called. She would essentially carry a hatchet, an axe, and she would walk into a saloon and start busting it up, start destroying things. And she got arrested something like 30 different times for her hatchinations, for attacking saloons and bars. She would lead raids, sometimes alone, but sometimes she had groups of people. She'd lead raids. Again, these temperance people meant business. They'd lead marches. They would guilt you. It was very Puritan. You see sort of the spirit of maybe the Salem witch trials sometimes. But they would attribute to alcohol sort of all the social ills that plagued America at the time. So they would point to mental illness. They would point to degeneracy. They would point to crime. They would point to poverty. They would point to corruption. And they would say, this is all because of alcoholic beverages. If we could make America dry, in other words, make America alcohol-free, you wouldn't have these things. You could literally empty the poorhouses. You could empty the mental hospitals. You could empty the jailhouses and the prisons, because alcohol is the root of these evils. So that was the idea. And they would point to, wives lamenting that their husbands would go to work, earn wages, and then spend half their wages at the bar with the boys before coming home. Or they would point to business owners and say these business owners have to suffer through having drunk employees, or employees that don't show up to work because they have a hangover. Or they would point to, the apparent connection between alcoholic beverage consumption and political corruption, or alcoholic beverage consumption and other vices like gambling or prostitution. So they had these very powerful moral arguments, social arguments for temperance that saw their culmination in the 18th Amendment and its ratification in 1919, prohibition of alcohol. There were opponents of prohibition, though, and the opponents would often, some of them would point to the Constitution itself and say, is such a national ban, a blanket ban on some substance, even legal? Is that even constitutional? Others, labor unions in particular, pointed to those connected to the industry itself, brewers, distillers, said, what's going to happen to these guys? Still others said, well, how's enforcement of something like this? What's it going to look like? How's it going to be done? They worried about that. Rhode Island did not ratify the 18th Amendment, for example, and in fact just nullified it, ignored it throughout the Prohibition period. You could still buy hard liquor on some shelves in Rhode Island. They chose not to enforce it, considered it wrong and unconstitutional. So Prohibition was not supported by everyone by any means, and it had its opponents across the country. Well, during the first 10 years of alcohol prohibition, something like 500,000 people were dragged before federal courts on bootlegging related charges, and something like 300,000 of them were actually convicted. So just as we see in our time, such a large portion of our prisoners, at least as of the time of this video, such a large percentage of our prisoners, those sitting in our prisons, of those who fill up our courts, they're there for drug-related charges. And just as in our day, a prohibition on drugs, a prohibition creates a vast organized underworld of criminality. There's massive profits to be made in the production of drugs in the smuggling and distribution of drugs, and in the monopoly of certain areas as distributor of those drugs. We see the same thing develop back in the 19-teens and 20s and early 30s during the Prohibition era. We see the rise of a organized underworld, a criminal element on a vast scale. This is a direct result of this government prohibition. Now it pays a lot to make, smuggle, and distribute this stuff. And if you can be the only one doing it in a certain area, that pays even more. And so not only do you have bootleggers and smugglers, but you also have thugs that can enforce your monopoly on a certain area. Again, we see this today with various drug dealers and cartels. So, for example, in the city of Chicago, hundreds of murders go unsolved, and an alliance develops between organized crime, most famously Al Capone, of course, organized crime and the city government and local law enforcement. And eventually it wasn't local law enforcement that got Al Capone. It was the feds. And they didn't get him for the murders or alcohol-related charges. They got him on tax evasion, and that's how they did it. Prohibition led to the creation of inferior types of alcoholic beverages. I mean, homemade brews. People are making it in their bathtubs, moonshine. A lot of this isn't the most sanitary. A lot of it is dangerous to drink. Some of it leads to actual deaths. And when it comes to producing and smuggling alcoholic beverages, beer and wine don't pay very well. The hard liquor, that's what pays. And so that's what is produced and distributed. And so the drinking habits of America arguably change as well, more in the direction of the hard stuff. And people are smuggling stuff in from Mexico and from Canada and from the Caribbean and from right off the shore, or again, they're moonshining in the forests and hills of the United States. When Prohibition is finally repealed, when the 18th Amendment is finally repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933, the criminal underworld, that organized criminal element that had developed around the prohibition of alcohol, shifted to other prohibited items and other prohibited activities, and in particular to drugs and to gambling.